What lessons can we learn from the political and economic crisis in Venezuela? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you too, and to be with our viewers and listeners once again.
Yeah, nice to have you all back. Richard, there's a lot going on in Venezuela, which I think has some valuable lessons for the United States and the American people. And so I thought we'd discuss that and then maybe discuss a little promotional on our upcoming conference that we're going to have, in which you're going to be the first speaker at the end of the month. So let's start with Venezuela. It's kind of interesting that they have a socialist dictator there who has made life just miserable for the Venezuelan people. I mean, that's what socialism does. It produces poverty. It guarantees poverty. And this guy is the successor. His name is Nicolas Maduro. He's a successor to Hugo Chavez, another socialist. And it was bad enough with the socialist system, but then the U.S. compounds the problem, the U.S. government, with an extreme form of sanctions, which made life even more difficult for the Venezuelan people. So they have a national election a few weeks ago, and Maduro immediately proclaims himself the winner, except that he refuses to release the vote tallies at all the local stations, which is kind of suspicious. Well, what the other side did was they seized the vote tallies. I'm not really sure how it works, but it's all these written tallies. They seized them at about 70 or 80% of the voting stations, and it turned out that the opposition candidate had actually won by a huge margin, like 2-1 or something like that. And well, Maduro has steadfastly refused to release the remaining ones, the ones he's in possession of. He's got his election council that ratified his victory, and the Supreme Court ratified his victory, all of which he controls. But most of all, he controls the military. And and Venezuela is a national security state, just like the United States is. And so, with the backing of the national security establishment, he's in control. And so they've had these massive protests in the streets, tens of thousands of people. He's rounded up 2,000 people, torturing them, presumably. The guy's a brutal dictator. And then his Supreme Court puts out a warrant for the arrest of the opposing candidate, who's in his 70s. And so this guy, after a few days, decides that this is not going to be a good thing to end up in jail. So he persuades the Spanish authorities to fly him out of the country, and he's gone into exile in Spain. And Maduro's happy because he's gotten rid of him, but Maduro's still dealing with the woman who's really in charge of the opposition forces, and she's still there. But one of the big lessons, I think, in all this is gun control. You've got advocates of gun control here in the United States that say, oh, this is the secret to ending all the mass killings because mass killers will obey the gun control law, or their real wish is that the government takes control over all guns in the country, like they've done in Venezuela. Well, the problem with that is that now the Venezuelans have no means of overthrowing their government. I mean, what are they going to go out in the streets and fight with sticks against well-armed soldiers? And that was the whole idea behind the Second Amendment, Richard, is that you have the right to resist tyranny, to overcome tyranny. Well, clearly these people are faced with tremendous tyranny. A guy that is not really standing for election. He's in there for life, backed by an all-powerful military, socialist system, rounding people up, no due process of law. I mean, you got all the prime characteristics of a tyrannical regime, but if you don't have guns, you don't have a way to resist all this. And I think that's probably the biggest lesson of all in this thing, that a disarmed citizenry ultimately becomes a very compliant citizenry, because as he starts rounding up more protesters or killing more protesters, there's less and less people to protest, especially when their presidential candidate, decides to escape to Spain. So I thought I'd just start out with that major lesson and see what you think about it.
Well, I think that as a complement to what you've been saying, I think we should recall how Venezuela got into this situation, beginning with the election of Hugo Chavez. Um, by South American standards, before these socialist experiments under Chavez and Maduro, Venezuela was a relatively prosperous country. Again, by South American standards, a huge natural resource base in fossil fuels, oil, which it exports and has exported around the world. Was there privilege? Was there favoritism? Was there corruption? Yes. But even with all of that, and while, of course, poverty pervaded parts of segments of the population, again, by South American standards, Venezuela was a relatively more prosperous economy, a middle class, uh, to the extent that the government had not totally straitjacketed, market-oriented activities that facilitated people being able to have again, a reasonably good life by the standards of that part of the world. And then Hugo Chavez came to power, and he proceeded to institute the revolutionary ideal of socialism, with the support, by the way, I should add as a footnote, the support and the encouragement of a variety of American progressives, including the U.S. Nobel Prize winner of economics, Joseph Stiglitz, who went down to Venezuela and met with Chavez and praised him for his progressive views. Uh, and what did Chavez do? He nationalized the industries. He confiscated wealth. He persecuted the middle class. Controls, planning, restrictions, all brought about a process of a strangulation and a consumption of the wealth of the country in the serving the political purposes and the pandering of those segments of society Chavez wanted as a base of support in bringing economic ruin to Venezuela. Chavez came down with a terminal illness. His picked successor was Maduro, who has now remained in power. And first Chavez, and certainly into Maduro, as wealth has been consumed and the society has become poorer, but he has to feed those segments of the society upon whom he relies, including the military. He's resorted to paper money inflation. The deficits must be covered because of your shrinking tax base due to your own misguided and socialist policies. And you then resort to the printing press to make up the difference. So Venezuela has had one of the highest inflation rates among the nations of the world. This ruin, this condition, this despair from the economic side is all due to once more a tried and failed socialist experiment in another country at the expense of real human beings. Now, in this setting, first Chavez and certainly Maduro now, through two election cycles, has been severely challenged by a semi-functioning opposition who have run candidates, and in this case, most recently, a presidential candidate, who all of the indications are won the election. Even some left-leaning governments in South America have criticized Maduro's manipulation of the election process to declare himself victory. In fact, against the majority, Maduro has therefore spoken out for minority rights, his minority right to rule over the majority, his power lusting. And this has resulted over this last several years, an exodus of, if I remember correctly, the numbers I've seen in the papers, something like 7 or 8 million Venezuelans. Now, many of them have moved to neighboring countries, such as Colombia, but a number of them have looked for sanctuary and an escape from poverty by moving into that country that is not as regulated and controlled and corrupt as a variety of South American countries are, that is into the United States. And the sanctions, of course, imposed, as you said, has made it no better. But the fact is that the cause of this misery, this tragedy, this hardship, this poverty, this oppression is due to, again, the dreams of political paternalists and social engineers who have a lust for power to impose their dreams upon entire populations. And so sure, that's reinforced by their own desire for power, that is personal power, that they will brook no opposition, no resistance, no U-turn away from the societies, as Hayek would call it, the new serfdom of people enslaved to their governments and left to wallow in poverty. And that's the source of these problems. And of course, then, as you were saying, Jacob, what do the people do? And historically, we know that one means of weakening the ability of opposing the tyrant is to deny them the means of resisting. And that means of resisting is some forms of weaponry that would enable them to stand up and in some way resist, and maybe even under the right circumstances overthrow their tyrants through the ownership of guns, either pistols, rifles, whatever. Every time that an authoritarian government, a totalitarian government has come to power and is in the process of solidifying its authority, one of the first elements of its agenda has been the denial of a right to own weapons and a confiscation of all such armaments from the citizenry to assure that no one dare attempt to stand in the way of the political power of the tyrant. And that's the dilemma the Venezuelans have now.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to note that just because there's this dictatorial brute in Venezuela doesn't give some kind of license to the U.S. government to be its own brute in terms of trying to oust this guy from power. I mean, what they've really done with their sanctions is put the Venezuelan people in a vice. And so they're being squeezed at both sides by the socialist system and the sanctions. And why were they so intent on removing Chavez and Maduro? Well, it wasn't because they have this philosophical objection to socialism. I mean, U.S. officials love their socialism too here at home: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, public housing, and so forth, farm subsidies, education grants. It's that these guys were opposing U.S. foreign policy. They were speaking out against U.S. foreign policy, and you're not supposed to do that. And so when you've got an empire, and the U.S. is clearly an empire, they don't like people who are dissidents within that empire. And we're talking about independent nation states now. And so they feel like, oh, well, we need to get rid of this guy because he's out there opposing our empire. And in the process, they bring untold suffering on the Venezuelan people. I think you mentioned that 8 million people have escaped the country. It's incredible. And many of those have come to the United States to save their lives. Now, another factor in this is the drug war. The drug war has contributed massively to the violence in Venezuela, the U.S. drug war. And in fact, it's kind of perverse, the drug war now, because they've got Maduro under indictment, criminal indictment in the U.S. system. It's not like he's ever been here in the United States pushing drugs, but that's the international flavor of the drug war. And so this guy has less incentive to get out of office, because if he gets out of office, he knows the first thing they're going to do is send him to the United States, where he's going to sit in a penitentiary for the rest of his life. So you have this perversity where the drug war is really helping to keep this guy in power. But let's morph over into the immigration aspect of this. I mean, a lot of these people have come to the United States to save their lives. And what is the response of status over here? Deport these people. They're invaders. They're bad people. They're meant to do us harm, when they're really just refugees, partly from U.S. foreign policy, the sanctions, along with the socialist system. And so they deport them. They send them back to their country of origin, where they're going to die or very likely to die. I mean, what kind of system does this, Richard? Which brings up our conference that we're going to be having starting later this month, and you're going to be kicking off this conference. It's a conference, The Case for Open Borders, and we've pulled together some of the greatest proponents, the most eloquent proponents, the most competent proponents of open borders. Now, why are we doing this? Obviously, it's not the most popular position in the world, but that's irrelevant. What, my position, Richard, is that whenever you see people, innocent people dying, especially in large numbers, and there's massive suffering, and there's a police state along the border that's destroying our rights and liberties, not to mention the rights and liberties of other people. It's that my second favorite quote of all my quotes that I've come across in this movement is, to sin by silence when one should protest makes cowards out of men. And as you know, you were vice president of academic affairs for the Future of Freedom Foundation when we first got started 34 years ago. And one of the first books we published was one that you and I co-edited, and you were the primary editor, The Case for Free Trade and Open Immigration. And we've been taking this position consistently for 34 years. And as I have said over, there you are.
There it is, The Case for Free Trade and Open Immigration. And we did this book. Oh God, it's scary to think about it. We did this book back in 1995, so it's almost 30 years ago.
Yeah, and we've been holding this position. I have been saying since the very beginning when we started this foundation, Richard, that this system that we have will never work. It is incapable of working. When people say, "Oh, Jacob, I've got a plan, I've got a plan, I've got a hope that we're going to make the system work," I said, "No, you're not. This is an inherently defective system." Getting us back to socialism, it's based on central planning. Ludwig von Mises says it produces planned chaos. That's what we've had on the border. And so I figure, Richard, even with this huge trend, including among some libertarians, of having the statist, centrally managed, centrally planned immigration system, this is no time for silence. A lot of these people are unable to defend themselves. We have to defend them. And so we pulled together some of the greatest speakers on this issue. I think this is probably going to be the best case for open borders in the history of the libertarian movement. It's by Zoom. We invite everybody to participate. And hopefully we can get this country to realize, Richard, that this is the only solution. Now, let me repeat that. I've been saying it for 34 years. This is the only solution to the immigration morass. There is no other solution. There is no way to make this system work. I've seen this every 4 years, of this paroxysms of anxiety and depression over the immigration crisis and stuff. It never goes away. I've seen it all my life. I spent almost half my life on the border, and I've seen this crisis up front. I've seen the deaths, not personally, but there along the border, and the suffering. I've experienced the police state, and I'm really, really pleased that we're doing this conference, Richard. And you're going to be kicking it off.
I think it needs to be recalled or emphasized or highlighted that the reason, as you're saying, this crisis never goes away, is that it's a perfect example of government control. Now, other than Kamala Harris, most people understand that price controls don't work. That's her anti-gouging mantra. Because if you ban something, or regulate the price, you just create a black market of some sort for it. We saw that with alcohol prohibition in the 1920s and early 1930s. We see it with gambling. We see it with prostitution. If you prohibit or try to prevent something that people want and are willing to pay for and others are willing to provide, inevitably you don't destroy it. You just move it underground, the black market. It's a market that is made illegal. Now, this entire immigration issue is an example of this. You're basically prohibiting people from entering the United States without the permission of the US government, both as to who can enter and how many. And what we see either in the desert area between Mexico and the United States, or in the Mediterranean between North Africa and Southern Europe, or in the English Channel between France and Great Britain, is that people who are looking for an escape, political persecution, religious oppression, a lack of economic opportunities for a better life due to the corruption and controls of their own government in their home country, people, as long as they have this desire to move where they think they can have it better for themselves and their children, and as long as there are people who believe that they can make a profit from enabling or facilitating their transportation in this way, you will have what we see along the border, along the Mediterranean, along the English Channel, to be the ones that get most popularized in the news. And therefore, it will never end. Just like the war on drugs, as you were alluding to, has never ended. This has been going on since 1914 with the establishment of the Pure Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and they're declaring a national declaration of the illegality of narcotics, and then the illegality of marijuana in 1935. Do people still smoke marijuana? Are people still dealing and using in hard drugs? Over 100 years now since the beginning of this war on drugs? Yes. Because if people desire something and they're willing to pay for it, there will be others who, if the price is right, will be willing to incur the normal costs of providing the supply and the additional risk of being caught by the authorities and imprisoned or even killed in some confrontation. It will not go away. And as long as people see a chance to live better, they will try to move to where the better is possible. And if those in control of those countries where into the country where people wish to move into, you'll just create this black market. They talk about, well, we have to get rid of the people dealers, those who are smuggling people from France to England or from North Africa to Italy and Greece, from Mexico across the Rio Grande or the desert into the United States. No, you will not get rid of it. This is a lesson of history for all of time. During the French Revolution, they made a violation of the price controls a justification for the death penalty. People still dealt in smuggling and dealing in black market prices and goods. And you can be arrested, captured and arrested and thrown into prison for a long time as one of these people smugglers. Has it stopped it? Has it slowed it down? No. Freedom, the desire for freedom and a better life always trumps the attempts of governments to restrict it. And this immigration crisis is just one example of that.
Yeah, and look how they come together, the confluence of these interventions. You've got the drug war that has really destroyed Mexico. I mean, it's turned Mexico into a hellhole of violence. Mexico is a very nice country to go visit. American tourists would drive to Acapulco. My parents drove to Acapulco for their honeymoon. And you didn't worry about kidnappers and drug cartels because they didn't exist, because drugs were legal. But now with the drug war, it's horrendous. And so look at the drug war, the violence they've fomented in Mexico and Venezuela and other Latin American countries. That then artificially produces a new flood of immigrants that then causes the status to say, oh my gosh, now we've got to really crack down on the immigration crisis. Right. And so it all comes, and then on top of all this, they want gun control here in the United States to deal with this drug violence problem, when we see what gun control does in Venezuela in terms of resisting tyranny. So it's really a problem all the way around that's rooted in the U.S. government's interventionism, as well as the Venezuelan socialism and the Mexico statism and stuff. But I say we need to focus on what we can do here at home, here in the United States, to create the example for the world of what we need for a free, prosperous, and harmonious society. I mean, we've got open borders, Richard, between the states. I mean, look at the harmony it produces. Nobody sits there in anguish, says, oh my gosh, everybody's moving from California to Austin, Texas. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Oh, they start pacing the floor. No, they see that the market starts ferreting things out. As prices start going up in Austin, people start going elsewhere. This is the way open borders work, and it's the only solution. So we're very happy. You're going to be kicking off this conference, and I'm really pleased with that, especially since you were there with FFF at the very beginning. You've been a strong principal proponent of open borders, but we got Brian Kaplan, who's written that great book on open borders. We've got Don Boudreau, who, like you, is former president of the Foundation for Economic Education. Ben Powell at Texas Tech University, the head of the great free market think tank. John Washington, who's written this magnificent book called The Case for Open Borders. Who am I forgetting? I know I'm forgetting somebody in there.
Oh,
Uh,
Jacob Hornberger.
oh, excuse me, I'll be there too. So I would invite everybody to participate. You know, this is a way, if you want to understand why some of us have been so committed to this idea, this conference is going to bring it all together. We're going to be addressing every argument. Oh, they're coming to get on welfare. Oh, they're invading us. Oh my gosh, the world's going to fall apart. We're going to address it all. So we look forward to having it.
For those people who are perhaps put off by the phrase open borders, classical liberals and most libertarians historically have not challenged the need for a government that is responsible for the protection of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and property within a political jurisdiction. What they do believe that as long as individuals do not harm others, there is free movement and residence and trade and work and travel within that jurisdiction and between jurisdictions. Open borders is what in the past has been called the right of freedom to move. And surely the right of freedom to move is no different than the right of freedom of exchange. And this has to be understood and not allow the emotional rhetoric that have been laid on certain phrases like open borders means, oh, you mean there's no longer borders? Of course there's borders, just like there's a border between Texas and Oklahoma or between one municipality and another in terms of the administrative responsibilities of protection of people's life, liberty, and property. But that doesn't mean that the jurisdictional lines on a map should prevent people from peacefully and honestly going about their business as they choose where they desire.
All right. On that eloquent note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you, Richard. I greatly enjoyed the conversation. As always, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your great support of FFF. You enable us to do programs like this and our conference and so forth, and to maintain this principled message on liberty that we've been promoting for 34 years. So thank you all very much. Richard, look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.